Stay tuned, because this week we're going to talk with Dr. Arthur Bodin, who is a clinical psychologist who does family therapy on Fathers Are Parents Too. Welcome to Fathers Are Parents Too. We have with us today clinical psychologist Dr. Arthur Bodin, and he has a counseling practice where he does therapy with individuals, couples, and families. And Dr. Bodin has a very distinguished record here. He's a senior research fellow at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto. He is an associate clinical professor of medical psychology at the University of California in San Francisco at the Medical Center. He was the president of the California Psychological Association, a president for the American Psychological Association's Division of Family Psychology. He has won an award for distinguished achievement in new directions in family therapy with the American Family Therapy Academy. He was Family Psychologist of the Year in 1990, and he is a distinguished practitioner in psychology of the National Academies of Practice. Welcome, Dr. Bodin. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
We've asked you here today to talk about your 5-point, maybe I would call it a roadmap of what you believe people working in family or individual therapy should be looking to accomplish, and what they can, if they apply themselves, I assume, expect to accomplish in doing work with you. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about generally how you work with a family or with a couple, and then we'll go into those 5 steps.
Well, I'll attempt to do it generally, but there are really very few things that I would always do with everybody, because I don't believe in one-size-fits-all therapy. I think it's better to tailor it to the particular people and to the particular problems or concerns that they're struggling with. And these 5 steps are really a lot more modest than what they might hope to accomplish. They're what I hope to accomplish in the first session, or at least by the beginning of the second session. And one of them is to establish a good relationship, although that isn't on the list that you're looking at.
Okay.
I rearranged it a little bit.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll let you just take that list.
There's no one magic moment for that.
That's
something to have in mind throughout the thing, throughout the session. And I try to help people learn, and I'm learning at the same time, to identify what they've been trying to deal with in terms of the concerns that have brought them. And that is, well, to define, first of all, the problems or concerns. And with a couple or a family, I like to talk with them one at a time in the first session, and then together, because I find that they speak a little bit more freely. They don't have to worry quite as much about being tactful so as not to hurt one another's feelings. And I also find sometimes that a person talks one way when they're with me alone, and quite another way when the spouse is in the room. And I would never get to discover that if I only talked with them jointly.
Or if you only talk with them alone. Why don't we run through the list, and then we'll take them one at a time, if I may. So I'm going to define the list here. And what you have here, and this is what you hope to accomplish, and what I found fascinating about this, well, let's just go through it. As you mentioned, first you would define the problems or the concerns of the individuals.
I get them to define
Right, with them, or they would define them for you. And that makes sense. But then you go on to say the second step, or the second thing you would hope to accomplish, and you point out in your paper here that you give, I assume, or go over with your clients, is your concept that a stitch in time saves 9. So let's take care of these things, and by doing this...
I don't actually bother to say that. They've already made the decision. They've made the decision to come in.
Okay, so they're trying basically to forestall something worse happening, and that's what you mean by that. So you define the problem, they define the problems or concerns, and then to learn how you or your family have been trying already to deal with these concerns. So far.
And that's because whatever they're already doing is precisely what isn't working.
Right. And sometimes they may feel like, well, gee, I'm giving it my all and it's not helping, but it may be because they need to try something different, not that it's just never going to work.
That's usually not something that they necessarily come to on their own. What they very frequently come in feeling is, well, I haven't tried hard enough or long enough.
So they're feeling a sense
or somebody
of
else in the family is telling them that.
Okay.
But I try to pry them loose from their allegiance to a method that already has shown it isn't working. Usually they've tried longer and harder than could reasonably have been expected.
Really? Well, that's, I suppose, in one way encouraging, and in another way a little bit demoralizing maybe for them if they've been at it for so long.
And it doesn't mean that it wasn't a sensible thing to have tried. It might have worked with somebody else, but...
or maybe even with them at a different stage in their relationship?
That's right.
Okay. Then step 3 is learn what you would like to have different as a result of therapy. And I think... I
want to learn it. I have them tell me.
Right. And I would imagine that they have to figure that out in the process. It may be very different than what they thought they were coming in originally to accomplish. And again, we'll go through these steps in depth. The 4th thing to accomplish would be to decide together in what order to work on your goals. And then 5th, to develop a plan. And again, what struck me about this was this is so practical. And it makes so much sense. And I think people have a sense, perhaps particularly people who haven't been in therapy or maybe have done counseling or therapy with someone with a different style, they have a sense that it's very exploratory, very kind of, I'm going to stick my hand in your innards and kind of feel around and see what I pull out. Whereas this is very much, it's very practical. And I thought this was great.
I hope it is.
That's why you're here. So, okay, well, we've talked already about step 1, which is working with them to define the problems or concerns. So again, step 2, learn how you or your family have been trying to deal with these concerns.
May I say something more about step 1?
Sure, go ahead.
I like to ask it in a way that doesn't just fish for the problems or concerns.
Okay.
I ask them to give me a picture through their eyes, the way they experience it, of the good points and the strengths and the inner and external resources that they can draw on as the building blocks for progress, as well as their picture of the main problems or concerns.
Now, isn't it also the case, I have certainly found, and because I work in the family law field, it's always broken down for me in my practice, men as compared to women, and it may not always be that way, but from what I see, it almost seems like there's always the man and the woman, and they may have very differing views of the same set of facts. And, and most people think a fact is a fact, and it, whatever, you know, it's one certain defined thing. But I have found that, for instance, the father, the husband's definition of what is his reality, which is based on that very same set of facts, is very different from the wife's reality. But for each of them, their reality is real. So, for instance, a lot of times my clients will say, how could she possibly say that when she knows that's not true? And I have to explain, for her that is true. She's not lying. That's her reality. And how...
And I have to stop the man from telling her or me that he knows what she knows. He's guessing what she knows. She knows what she knows, but he doesn't.
And he thinks he does because he's looking at the same set of facts. But it's sort of like the blind man and the elephant, isn't it?
But let me suggest that you not call them facts. The gentleman in the next room to mine, Dr. Paul Václavic, has made this point very eloquently. He says, if you and I were to disagree about the height of this table surface from the carpet, we could get out a tape measure and settle that without any argument, because there exists in society a non-elastic yardstick for settling questions of that kind. But suppose that we went to a party and we said, did you meet Joe? And you said, oh God, he was chilly. And I said, yeah, I thought he was very warm. There isn't any fact about that. There's your construction of it and my construction of it. Your feeling about it, my feeling about it. We're in the realm now of opinion, not in the realm of fact. Taste and opinion are different, and it's sort of not quite civilized to speak of it as if it were in the realm of fact. Once you do that, you're not making room for the other person's opinion to be different from yours. And then there is a very odd middle case. If two people went to a party together and the next morning they got into a discussion about whether Joe was a warm guy or a cold guy, whether Joe said a certain thing. There was a fact. If they had a video recording or a tape recording, they could settle that, like the non-elastic yardstick. But if there was no tape going, it has now moved from what was a fact into the realm of opinion.
Ah,
it's shifted.
okay. Okay.
And it would be much more efficient for them to agree to disagree because they have no way to settle it.
Okay. That makes sense. Okay. So then, and we're discussing this in the realm of learn how your family's been trying to deal with these things and identifying the problem. And so I am imagining that it may often be the case that each party or multiple parties in the family therapy would even consider the problem to be something. They each have a different view of what the problem is.
Right, and I wouldn't say just problem singular. Very often people tell me 2, 3, 4 problems. Sometimes it's just one. One of them might say there are 3 problems, and or sometimes they like the word concerns better. And the other one might have also 3, and maybe only one of those overlaps.
Wow, okay. I can see where it can get very, very difficult to really sort of boil it down to. And again, that's why these steps are great.
What I do after talking with them separately is I bring them into the room together and I ask each one, like the dating game, what do you suppose he told me are the main problems or concerns, and the strengths and the good points? And then I turn to him and I say, and you're in charge of your own feedback. And I also get to see whether he's forthcoming with the feedback or whether she has to pry it out of him. So I get to see, he gets to find out how well she knows, and she may find out he doesn't know her point of view anywhere near as well as she thought he had gotten it, in which case it may turn out, when she does her double take, to be a relief. Oh, maybe the fact that you didn't know it is why you're not doing more of what I want.
Not because you don't care.
Right.
Or because it's...
And then there's the opposite case where she finds out that, to her surprise, he knows her point of view a lot better than she'd given him credit for tuning in which case her double take may be, then how come you're not doing more of what I want?
Or how come, and then maybe his response is, well, I have been, but you've been looking for it in a certain shape, so you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
We just have a few minutes left before we have to go to break, so very quickly I want to make sure that we get to step 4, which is decide together in what order to work on your goals, because that is so fundamental. Because the first part of that is decide together, which is saying, you know, that's the purpose of being here, so you can learn to work together and work things out. Would you say that in most cases you're able to get a couple or a family, you know, 2 or more people to that point? Because to me that sounds like if you can get them there, that's the large part of the battle, isn't it?
Yes.
What happens when they get to that point? Is there an epiphany? Do they just go, my God, you've given us the keys? No,
they don't usually feel like they have the keys that fast. I do ask at the end of the first session, I turn to each one separately and say, how was this session for you? How was this session for you? I listen very carefully to what they're saying, because if there was any aspect of it that they didn't like, I ask them what they feel they would find more useful. Same as, what have you tried so far? If they mention any previous therapy, I want to know then, and what did you find? Did you find it useful? What did you find most useful about it? Were there any, if they didn't find it useful, what did you not care for or find not so useful? Because I don't want to stumble into the same thing that's already been tried with them.
Now, we have about a minute left, and I'm just wondering, has there ever been something that you perhaps learned during your studies in becoming a psychologist, or something that was considered to be the way to do it, that by tailoring your practice as you've been asking these couples, does this work for you, what worked, what didn't, was there ever anything that you finally said, out the window, this doesn't work for anybody? You know, who thought of this?
No. I would say that I originally believed, long before I went to graduate school, that the psychoanalytic approach was very intriguing, and I became increasingly aware of and interested in a whole variety of other approaches. I still think that it provides some very good ways of looking at personality as a technique of therapy. Well, I don't want to get into a public debate about that, but I think it's probably better as more powerful as a personality theory, in the sense of being efficient. I'm not saying that psychoanalysis can't be useful. I'm saying it is a long and painstaking method, and a lot of people There are some people, like maybe artists and writers, who, and maybe people who work with people, who would find it very useful. But there are also a lot of people who want something faster, and it doesn't always have to take that long. I'm not saying that that you can always do therapy briefly, because I don't believe that for a moment.
But it's not the be-all and end-all. There are other
There are
ways
many
that may work
approaches,
just
and
as
I
well.
think that they can be sometimes integrated and blended with one another, in the sense that you may, for certain parts of the problem, be using one technique, and you may shift gears when you're addressing another aspect of it. Or as you learn that maybe the wife is responsive to the first way, but the husband isn't, you may have to use a different way with him.
Okay, okay. And we're going to take a break now, and when we come back, we have questions for you from the audience. We'll be right back.
I'm a dad and a member of FREE, the Father's Rights and Equality Exchange. Most dads out there would love to spend more time with their kids, to be a real part of their lives. FREE wants to change the notion that all divorced dads are irresponsible, because most of us are dads who are responsible and we're working for a chance to share the parenting. If you want to learn more, please call us at 1-500-4DADS. That's 1-500-4DADS. And remember, fathers are parents too.
Welcome back to Fathers Are Parents Too. We're talking today with psychologist Arthur Bodin from Palo Alto, California, and we have some questions from the audience for Dr. Bodin. Yes?
Yes, Dr. Bodin. A lot of times a couple will seek counseling through you, and they probably have their parents or their grandparents advising them. Do the couples outside other family members, do they help your process, or are they more harmful to your process? And
The
how?
answer is yes and yes. They can help, they can hinder, and I usually ask about, as I get to know the situation more, I go on what I might call an informed fishing expedition about how they might reasonably have learned whatever pattern it is that's perhaps upsetting them, or that is maybe it's the husband, a pattern upsetting himself, or his wife or girlfriend, and that maybe isn't quite at the bullseye of your question. I think more you were asking, what if they're whispering in their ears between sessions? Yes, I want to know that, and it's all the more important, not only in therapy, but in, let's say, divorce mediation, because of course there will be people advising them, friends, family, maybe a former spouse. It's important to know what influences there are, and you find out by asking. And I might caucus separately with them to find out something about that. And I instead of saying don't talk about it with them, I would say please do talk about it with them. The same thing if they have an attorney in a divorce mediation situation, because I want the attorney fully informed. Also, people are less fearful about negotiating if they're being advised en route to some proposed agreement. But in the regular therapy situation, definitely they can be helpful or hindering. And I might, on some occasions, want to get in that other generation, or it might be a sibling. And this has been called network therapy. Carolyn Atneve and Ross Speck many years ago wrote about that. They sometimes have had groups as large as 200 extended families fly in from all parts of the country. This is rather unusual. I haven't done anything on that scale.
Well, where'd you put them?
It's sort of assembling the village.
Wow, wow. We have another question for you, yes.
Hi, Dr. Bodin. Could you tell us a little bit about how parental conflict affects children in some of the things you've seen?
In 30 seconds.
First of all, it does affect children, but differently according to age. Up to maybe 5 or 6, children are more likely to cry. After that, boys and girls are likely to respond differently. And what I'm saying now is just a generalization for which many exceptions could be found. Girls are more likely to show anxiety and super concern about making things better for their parents, trying to be like a mediator. Boys are more likely to act out in some angry way. But those are just generalizations.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
And they're learning by role model. They're learning a pattern which isn't going to serve them so well as they get older.
Right, right. Okay, yes.
Yes, Doctor, very interesting presentation here. What do you do, and I assume this happens, when both parties are not, I'll say, negotiating in good faith? One of the parties are not interested in a solution, but merely going through a process. How do you handle that?
First of all, I wish I could read minds, but there was no course nor anything in my experience yet which has enabled me to do that. So I don't feel that I necessarily know. That doesn't mean that I would contradict one of them who might say this about the other, but I would say, clearly you've had some experience which leads you to this conclusion, which is a way of relabeling it as an interpretation. And opening the door to the possibility that maybe it's a correct inference, maybe it isn't. And I want to hear how the person feels they know, because very often somebody is quite sure that they're more expert on what's going on in the partner's mind than the partner, him or herself. And in some way it could even be possible. It could be that the other person is less aware of the impact of what they're doing and is putting out signals which, let's say, the husband interprets a certain way, and maybe she doesn't have a clue that that's how he is perceiving it. So I want to get them to see that there are possibilities, there are possible interpretations of what's going on other than that it's bad faith. They may sincerely believe that they have succeeded in getting through to him, conveying to him the message which they intended to send. Whereas because they don't process it through the same experiential filter that he brings to it, his receiver may be tuned to a different wavelength than their sender.
What a great way to put it. That's great. Another question.
You have 7 steps that you suggest, and I'm wondering, do they need to go through 1 through 7? And the other question is, what if they get all the way to 6 but have problems with 3? Do you have to start over again or go back? I'm wondering how you work that out.
These are just steps for the first session. This wasn't a blueprint for the whole therapy. And I kind of lead them through these, so they're probably not going to get hung up on like, let's say 3 or 4, I don't remember which number was which, about, well, how have you been trying to deal with these problems or concerns so far? Then they tell me what they're trying, and I'm probably going to say, unless it seems very atypical, well, that sounds like a sensible thing to have tried. How well has it been working for you? How satisfied are you with the results? Well, not very, or we wouldn't be here. Maybe you believe that you haven't done it long enough or hard enough. I don't know. Are you saying you'd be ready for a change? So, they don't really get stuck. That whole step just takes a couple of minutes.
Okay, thank you. We have another question.
Although sometimes it isn't something new that's needed. Sometimes it's a repackaging, maybe in terms of better timing or a better delivery. Oh. Maybe they're trying to get their husband's attention. He's a great football fan, and they don't wait for the commercial. It's the playoff game, and they try to do it in the middle. Well, it's not great timing. So sometimes what they're doing is sensible, and with a little different approach of the same fundamental idea, it might still work.
Wow. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Yes, Dr. Bodin, you used the term acting out earlier, and unfortunately I've heard that term in a courtroom, and it always implies something bad. I've never understood what acting out is. Is it a term of art, and just exactly what does that mean?
Thank you for that question, and I'm going to slap my hand for having used a term of art instead of plain English. All I meant by that is acting up in a way that somebody in the adult world doesn't like. That's all I meant.
So does it necessarily always signify something bad, or is it,
No.
again, a judgment? It's the opinion of the adult.
It's a judgment
that it's
by one, not necessarily both, of the adults on the scene. And it may be that showing anger may be a very appropriate response to some impossible situation that one or both parents have placed the kid in. It might be a very healthy response. Not all display of anger is necessarily inappropriate.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you to do the impossible. We have about 2 minutes left, and in about half of that time or a little more, I'm wondering if you could very briefly touch on what your experience has been on the effect of children once there has been a disuniting of the family to be deprived of either parent. Of course, there's a lot of concern right now about father absence, but I imagine mother absence would be a problem as well. And I've always believed children need access to both parents. So can you very briefly address that?
Yes, the book Surviving the Marital Breakup by Judith Wallerstein and Joan Kelly, where they studied, I think it was about 60 families in Marin County, showed that whether the custody arrangement was called joint custody or sole custody, those kids did best who had two factors: frequent and continuing contact with both parents, and lower conflict level rather than toward the higher end of things. And it's interesting to note that the conflict level after the divorce was more important for their post-divorce adjustment, the children's post-divorce adjustment, than the pre-divorce conflict level.
Now, sadly, I'm familiar with that study, and sadly, some legislators have interpreted that to mean that children should be protected from the conflict by excising one of the parents. And, of course, then what happens is you have little conflict, but also no contact with the other parent.
And there was a book years ago that for a while many of the judges were following. It was called, I think it was called Beyond the Best Interests of the Child by Goldstein, Freud, and Solnit, which basically said that to avoid conflict, whoever got custody, this preceded legalized joint custody in California, must have absolute sole power to determine visitation. Well, consider this. I think, it's my impression that in probably about 90% of instances, one parent comes to the realization that things aren't working out and has, if you want to say, courage before the other one to say, you know, I think we need to get apart, or I need to get apart. And the other one then experiences him or herself as being the dumpee. I hate to use such crass terms, but that person feels very angry, doesn't understand why the one who's dumping also feels angry, and that contributes to the heat. The person who feels dumped, if you give that person the power to cut off the other, that's a terrible, vengeful power you've given.
And sadly, on that note, what I have to do is cut us off because we've run straight out of time. But you can contact Dr. Bodin in Palo Alto. You're listed, right?
Yes.
And thank you for being with us on Fathers Are Parents Too.